Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. In today's episode, the long run, we want to try to focus in specifically on the concept of endurance, lactate threshold, if we're going to make a distinction, is perhaps best used to understand the concept of where velocity comes from, but it doesn't really answer the question of endurance, long distance efforts at a constant sub-threshold rate. Might see a 10, 20, 30 beat increase in heart rate across the duration of effort without any increase in power production. What meaning do we make of that? And how can we use that kind of observation to think differently about preparing our body from an endurance and stamina perspective? Let's get into today's episode. Long run is one of those pieces of training for runners, which is kind of this very symbolic, totemistic experience. I think it's seen as essential, it's seen as transformative, it's seen as something to be careful of. It's sometimes seen as a sign of like signifying your level of commitment, how hardcore you are. It communicates about what your intentions are. The 20-mile run has a certain ritualistic status and significance that goes beyond any possible meaning as being different from an 18 or a 19-mile run. I don't know of other endurance sports that have a comparable or directly proportional kind of liminal, transformative, at least in terms of its social construction and meaning, kind of, training practice as the long run. It's also something that people tend to look at with a lot of apprehension, that some people really dread long runs. They find them to be very difficult. Some people believe that they should be avoided. I've had people share the point of view that people under the age of 20 should never be allowed to run longer than 13 miles because it's bad for them. So there's a lot of sort of baseless beliefs about these kinds of training practices that the long run represents. And I say kinds of training practices because although maybe there's not this equivalent symbolic value of endurance session in other sports per se that has the same within the sport significance or resonance of the long run in running training, there are other practices that are fill that same space or that same place. So when we think about this, right, we're really looking at the long run as something that I think people don't really fully understand the purpose of its utility. And when I say long run, I use that to mean, not just the literal long training run for runners, but again, the sort of long endurance session equivalent for any other sport. So, I think using the long run is sort of this more generic placeholder for all of those different kinds of things. And, I think one of the ways I hear this represented is this idea that if you can run, if you're a great runner, you don't need long runs to run fast, or that long runs are something you only need if you do the marathon. It's just like when I was in college running and, maybe this was a product of that specific time coming out of the ideas of the late 80s throughout the 90s of this at least interpretation of stuff like Jack Daniel's running formula that you just don't really need to run a lot if your training is specific and targeted. And you can find YouTube Jack Daniel's saying that after 40 miles a week, you're basically getting 80 to 90% of everything you're going to get out of your running training. And I don't know if that's true. I don't think that that's true. I don't really see anything that suggests that's true. Overwhelmingly, the evidence says in aggregate that people who train a lot more than 40 miles a week tend to be a lot better. But I also think there are a lot of people who don't make it into data tables who are, trying to get beyond, that 5 to 7 mile a day number, right? Which you might say that 45 to 60 minutes a day training volume, and are not having success. So one aspect of that is people who do not wake up every day and have a desire every day to go out and do that amount of running, to do that amount of training. And if that's the case, right, that's a limiting factor. And if you can't get to the point where that's something that you want, a way that you want to spend your time, then that's probably never going to work for you. And I've know plenty of people who have all of the aptitude and the capacity in the world and even seem to be able to enjoy the stuff when they're actually doing it. But then they just, more often than not, they wake up in the morning and at no point in the day do they want to get out and do that. So that can be a limiting factor around this stuff. But I also think, and for those people, I think that's a valid experience, right? They might really want, the outcomes and to get to that point, and they might genuinely want to do it, but they're sort of stuck. And maybe that's a different question for a different episode. But we also have people who do push to go beyond that, and then they just don't really see an increasing return. And the idea of the long run is transformative. This idea that, well, if you just start doing these long runs, you're going to show up and be the man, is similar to the idea that, well, if you just go out and you start doing more and more miles a week, you're going to be awesome. And that's something where I think we do see more of a clear sort of parallel to other sports, right? In running, there's something mythical and magical, if you will, that's imbued to the 100-mile training week. And it's kind of like, well, why? I mean, that comes from the Arthur Lydiard thing, but those guys weren't running 100 miles a week. They were running like 120 to 150 miles a week. And their training strategy wasn't to run 150 miles a week or 100 miles a week. Their training strategy was to look at their sessions and think about every day when they were training, every time they went out to train, what did they want to accomplish? How did that relate to their goals? And then try to apply the strategy that they had in mind. And because of their velocity as an athlete, it led to that number. But in other sports that count volume in terms of hours, 20 hours a week is a number. 30 hours a week is sometimes something you hear people talk about, I think, in cycling and, triathlon, for example. You might, sometimes come across people holding up this, 30 hours a week, and you see people pushing it up to 30 hours a week. If you spend 4 weeks training 25 to 29 hours, right, we're basically in 2 months, you put in about 200 hours, and then you look at your training data and your threshold has improved by 10 watts, which basically means it hasn't improved because that's well within a standard deviation. I think that raises questions about what's going on. Are you wasting your time? If you genuinely love spending your time doing that every day, then you're not wasting your time. But if you are spending that additional time, beyond whatever you're sort of self-selected, sort of just only for the enjoyment of the day-to-day exercise would be, which, right, I mean, if you're doing 14 hours a week, which is half of that, that's still 2 hours a day, which is, not an insignificant amount of time to invest in any kind of physical activity on a day-to-day basis. So if you're investing, double that amount, if you're investing 100 miles a week, if you're putting in 50,000 yards or 100,000 yards, I have no idea, right? But if you're, swimming 5 or 6 miles a day or something like that, whatever it is, right? You're doing your Nordic training for 20 hours a week, pick your sport, pick your high volume benchmark. Why are you doing that? Right? Like, how are you arriving at that point? Are you getting the benefit from that you imagine you should be able to get. And I think a lot of times the answer is sort of, but also not really. And I think the reason why that is the case is because if you are able to do that much volume, it's probably the case that a lot of it is going to necessarily have to be at a lower intensity, because otherwise it just wouldn't be possible to do that for week after week after week. It's just not sustainable. But I also think it's the case that, we're not maybe seeing the magnitude of response that we want. But I also think that's where, again, like, what questions are we asking ourselves? So, I think the starting question we should be asking here is not, what are the training things that people say are transformative? I talked about this actually in the last episode, right? Of like, how are we selecting the inputs that are going to lead us to try to make determinations about what is and what is not valuable or impactful to do in training? I think if we ask the question, what is the limit on how long we can hold X intensity, I think that's a step towards trying to find something that's more meaningful, right? In terms of figuring out what is the value of what we're trying to do. And when we ask that question, right, that's a different question than the question that lactate threshold answers. It's not unrelated, and I'll explain why it's still related in a moment. But it's when we look at this question of how long can we hold X intensity, that's pointing at this issue of stamina. So, speed is like, how fast do we have the capacity to actually sort of go for any length of time, regardless of how short. Endurance is the capacity to just go no matter how much we slow down, how long can we continue to go. And then stamina, we can say, refers to how long can we go at a given pace. And one answer, I would say, if we take this threshold concept and, well, how can we relate to this? And I think this is where we want to start, because we've talked a lot about threshold on this podcast. And I think clarifying how this does relate and doesn't relate then defines the space that needs to be answered with something else. So one answer to the question of like, what's the limit on how long we can hold X intensity would be what percentage of lactate threshold that we are engaging. Okay. So simply put, what we see is that when we have blood lactate concentrations that are low, particularly if you're doing, a progressive test, right, and you start at a low enough intensity, there will be a number of steps where the blood lactate concentration will be very low. And probably, I think for people who have a reasonable basic level of aerobic fitness, we'll probably see a number of steps where the value is less than 1 millimole. And then there will be a step of intensity where the lactate concentration will start to increase. And for every increase in intensity after that, the lactate concentration will continue to get higher and higher and higher. And I think that what that is a reflection of, right, is the relationship that we experience when we exercise, which is that at the point at which the blood lactate concentration is going up, our capacity to sustain X intensity, whatever that X intensity is at that higher blood lactate concentration, is the potential duration of that is significantly less than it was with less blood lactate concentration. So if we are working at a lactate concentration that is, at a percentage of lactate threshold intensity measured in velocity or power that is below that threshold, right? Because that's what the threshold is. It's the point of intensity where if you go beyond that intensity, the blood lactate concentration will start to increase. Okay. So when you go, and it doesn't mean that you might be able to exercise for quite a while at that intensity without it continuing to go up, but that if you took another additional step in intensity, it would go up again. So it's the point at which any additional steps see a higher level of blood lactate than was measured in the previous level of intensity. Okay. And so this is why people continue to view lactate as this sort of marker of fatigue, and it is correlating with that. But there is something causing this to happen, but it's not the blood lactate. The amount of blood lactate in the blood is not, in my interpretation, destroying our ability to maintain X intensity. I'm interpreting that accumulating lactate as an available metabolite that the body produces in proportion to demand. So if Eliud Kipchoge is probably running 5-minute pace or 5:15 pace, his blood lactate is probably 0.8 or 0.7, right? If I'm doing that, my blood lactate is probably 14 to 16, okay? That doesn't mean that I can be Eliud Kipchoge. That's not what I'm saying. But it does mean that, I am also producing probably a lot of lactate, right? My body has to be able, if we're both running 5:15 pace, then both of our bodies have the capacity to produce metabolites sufficient to create that force. But if we view lactate as this preferred metabolite, what do we see? Well, then we see that when lactate concentration is down, now we're more efficient, and a more efficient system can always last for longer. Okay, so what's going on is the blood lactate level is a reflection of our efficiency, and the increasing in concentration of blood lactate is not destroying our ability to maintain what we're doing. Okay, it is an indicator probably of how much room for aerobic improvement we have. And when people are posting this is my peak blood lactate, I've said this before. Yeah, that's kind of interesting on some level, but it's also kind of meaningless on another level, because it's like, all that represents is that's available metabolite that you don't have the physiological adaptations to take advantage of and convert into actualized energy. But when people insist on interpreting it as, I'm not running fast because the blood lactate is higher, it's like you're struggling. It's more so the case that I'm working really hard, right? I'm really struggling to produce this force, a force that somebody else, like an Eliud Kipchoge or other people, can produce that force needed for them to run that equivalent speed very easily, right? And so what do you see in those cases? The blood lactate is low, right? So it tells us that when we can take advantage of the lactate, we're probably going to be very efficient. When we aren't able to take advantage of the lactate and it's just sitting there in the waiting room, then we aren't going to be very efficient. And so that can kind of make it seem like the lactate then is the reason for limitations in endurance. And I'm not saying that it doesn't have a space in answering the question, how long can we hold X intensity? But I am saying that it doesn't offer enough of an answer for us to say, well, we've answered that, let's move on. Because ultimately lactate threshold is really more about how fast we can go, okay, than it is about how long we can go fast. Okay, yes, we're talking about efficiency, and efficiency, does have an impact on that, but it's not the sole explanation. I mean, a simple way to recognize this to be true is, people who do additional volume of training that in and of itself wouldn't really have much of an impact on lactate threshold seem to do better in competition than people who do the same amount of lactate work that does impact lactate threshold without that additional exercise intensity. Or actually, maybe we should say more specifically, without that addition of all that low intensity exercise, And another example of that is people who add in longer runs are more likely to sustain for longer, even though the longer run is maybe not really something that is as direct or as sort of specifically impactful to the lactate threshold. Although long runs, long endurance sessions are extremely, ambiguous or open-ended in terms of how you might interpret that or make meaning out of what that really implies or entails. So when we're looking at that from that perspective and we're trying to make sense of, well, what is the impact, what is happening here? It's hard to really know what people are doing because, you can say I ran 20 miles and that can mean 20 different things, right? So I think if we recognize this concept here, again, right, this is more about how fast we can go when we think about lactate threshold than how long we can go fast. So like if we can move a mass with a greater velocity, only if we can apply more force, right? So your body is a certain entity of mass, right? Let's say. And if you want that to move faster, we have to apply more force. So if we want to move our body faster, then physiologically, we need the ability to produce movement through metabolism, which means that we need to be, metabolically converting a greater amount of energy in order to create that greater amount of force. So therefore, it makes sense to interpret lactate production as accumulation as proportional to work demand. That when you exercise, you are making a work demand on the body. The body then makes that metabolic stuff available, right? The metabolic capacity, activates, and then like we can or cannot do that, based on how fit we are. And that's why we can have this situation where we can sort of in the short term create the velocity or apply the force, but then we can't sustain it. Right. And so, we already know in general that our ability to produce speed, is not predictive of our ability to sustain speed. And when we're seeing all that lactate accumulate, right, it does mean we're well over our efficiency point, which is why time to failure becomes very short, right? That time to failure gets reduced very rapidly. And it's almost like an exponential reduction in time to failure, which tracks with the exponential increase in fatigue. But in order to produce this additional velocity, right, when we improve our lactate threshold, people are talking about, and I don't agree with this, to be clear, people are talking about this idea of my body doesn't produce enough lactate for me to go fast. And that they're really interested in this idea of, what's your glycolytic max? And they're using blood lactate concentration to determine your glycolytic max. And I just don't see that as making sense, because the lactate is a metabolite. And so the increased concentration so first of all, it's like if you have two people who are both running 430 pace, we're both riding 500 watts, and one person has 4 millimoles of lactate, and the other one has 8 millimoles of lactate, that doesn't matter because they're both going the same speed. Okay? And even if, let's just pretend that neither of them can go any faster than that. Okay? It doesn't matter who has more lactate, but there's these paradigms with triathletes who will say I have a better glycolytic max. It's no, nobody cares. Right? You don't get to the end of a race and then take out a laminated index card and hand it to somebody, like you're playing Go Fish, and be like, hey, this is my glycolytic max, what's yours? And then determine the finishing order based on that, right? If you can, all it is just achieving velocity. And this is why I don't really get the Lionel Sanders fixation with how much lactate he can produce, because who cares? When you're talking about, speeds over lactate threshold, especially when you're talking about short-term, force, you want to be able to just how fast you're going, that matters. And if you probably have less blood lactate, then you're going at that speed probably with more efficiency, right? So you're probably more likely to be able to go faster. But then what's happening is as we're getting quicker, we're getting to the point as our fitness improves where in order to go faster, we're going faster with less perceived work. Okay, we're going faster with less perceived work, but we can't actually be going faster without more actual work. So our perception of work, which really, we say hard work, but it should really be stressful exertion, right? We have reduced or eliminated that feeling of stressful exertion because we're creating that force with efficiency. But we're working 6-minute pace. If you weigh 150 pounds, 6-minute pace is 6-minute pace, and if that takes you 310 watts to run 6-minute pace or something, then that's what it's going to take you. And the only way it's going to be easier to run 310 watts is if you can produce those 310 watts with a greater level of efficiency. And, you can get good lactate threshold returns on a 7 to 8 hour training schedule with anywhere from 3 to 4, maybe sometimes 5 of those hours being, 60-minute sessions where you're doing, intervals of where some of that time is lactate threshold intervals and some of that time is sort of easy break, recovery intervals. You can get great returns, right? But what about endurance? That athlete is unlikely to have great endurance, all else being equal. Okay, they might have better endurance than other people, but we already know that's true in athletics, that there are people who can spend very little time exercising, training, working out, and can go out and exhibit much better levels of performance than other people. But, I think a lot of times that has to do with they might be racing against other people who just simply are just exhausted, from trying to make improvements. And so then, in the short term, or sometimes in the long term, right, if that individual never figures out how to find the balance and not put themselves in exhaustion, they're never going to get better. They're never going to get to that point that they want to be at. So to look at this question in a more concrete way, this is why I want to think about, the long run as an exemplar, or the sport-specific endurance session as an exemplar, but we're really sort of using this as a additional placeholder, if you will, for the concept of what does endurance really mean in general? What does stamina mean in general? And I do think stamina is probably a better word, because I do think that there is the quantity of I can go for a long time, but I just might sort of be decelerating across that period of time, versus I can go for a long time, but I'm not decelerating, right? I'm continuing to persevere at a particular pace. So you can call that, you could say specific endurance, or endurance at X, or you can say stamina. I like the word stamina. So that's what I'm going to mean here when I use the word stamina. So let's think more specifically about what is a long run, or what is the long endurance session. People do them all the time. There's overwhelming real world evidence that they're clearly beneficial and impactful. When I coached cross country, by the last 2 years of coaching, we had progressed to doing an 18-mile run every Monday from the middle of August, when we had our first practice, until the middle of October, right? And then hopefully prior to that, over the summer, the runners were going out and were running, 18-mile runs, 20-mile runs periodically as well, with a secondary longer run, but not as long run during the week too. So then when we came in to the season, right, we weren't trying to introduce this out of nowhere, right? There was a, process of building into that. So then when we're doing the long runs and we're adding in other sort of more targeted managed training sessions, we're not just shoveling all of this stuff out of nowhere. That being said, I had athletes who would not, this is a classic cross-country thing, right? You had athletes who would not train over the summer. Like, they did not care, what I said. They were just not going to do that, or if they did, they were getting input from, other people who didn't believe that, what we were doing was valuable, which I didn't understand the point of showing up and being out of shape. Okay. I don't think that that's something that can be debated. It's not beneficial to have less fitness, because then you're just wasting time, and you're just not going to get as fit, right? Because over X period of time, you can only make so much fitness gain compared to where you started. So if you start at a low level of fitness, you can't get in shape. And I had, athletes who would show up, and their, folks would, have guided them to not really exercise or run, much over the summer, despite kind of our team's suggested thought process or approach, because they believed that was going to put them in the best position to be the best runner on the team. And it didn't work, and it would have been interesting to see if I had kept doing coaching in that particular space over the long term, what would have happened. I tend to think that it would have continued to be true. And there are people who do this in college. They just don't really run over the summer, right? A lot of people, it's just if they don't have that environment, they don't have that structure, it's just not going to happen. But so with our 18-mile run, that's something I thought was very impactful. for our athletes. I thought it made a big difference in terms of our capacity to be conditioned to run the races, but also to just be conditioned to do the kinds of workouts that we wanted to do as a part of our overall training routine every week. And, I think we did, in the both of those years, we won the state championship and the all-state champions, the so-called meet of champions here in the state of New Hampshire. I think it would be a little bit ignorant to say that that was the singular difference maker, because we did a lot of things differently compared to our competitors. I think we ran a different amount of miles per week. We didn't run the most total miles in a week. There were some rumors that we had run 100 miles a week, which I guess that would have been cool, but they weren't. They were maybe running 55 miles a week, maybe 60 miles a week at absolute most. It just wouldn't be true to claim that we were running 100 miles a week. But that's that idea of oh yeah, right, they're only good because they're overtraining. And I had, some people say that to me in a little bit more indirect, which it's I know what you're saying, you know what you're saying. Why not just, call a spade? But I think people feel if they're beating around the bush somehow, that it's a more elegant way to sort of criticize or demean what somebody's doing. But it's so the athletes are outperforming everybody. The athletes are not miserable. The athletes are not getting injured, but because we're being perceived as doing a lot of running, oh, well, you're overtraining, right? Which just shows how people don't understand these concepts. And, a lot of the conversations about these sports and their ideas are just, weaponizing what should be things that are used to try to reach some meaningful practices and approaches, and instead just turning them into clubs to just try to bring people down, which I think is a fair criticism if you have athletes spending lots and lots of time exercising, and then they're unhappy, they're not improving, they're not getting any additional benefit from what they're doing. Maybe they're worse. That should be criticized. But we tried to, we had the data to demonstrate that, and we had the anecdotal experiences of the athletes to support that, right? So there's a lot of other things we were doing well. I also think that, running and feeling that you're training in a unique way in that kind of environment can be important for giving yourself confidence, which I don't think confidence can raise your lactate threshold. But I think that if you're fit, that feeling confident and feeling, that, you can be out there and, you belong at that level of the race. I think it can be intimidating to try to make that transformation, and feel that, okay, I can be up here. This is okay. I'm not going to blow up. I'm not going to embarrass myself by looking like I overreached or whatever in the race. So there's other benefits too that maybe are not huge, but probably were present. And anecdotally, I would say, and I would have said this at the time too, that I think the long run certainly seems to increase the time to failure in a race for an athlete. Or we might think of it as your time to the point of fatigue in a sense, or maybe you might think of it as sort of decelerating the ramp rate from fatigue into the point of failure, that maybe you'll sort of get to the point of fatigue, but then you just kind of stay there, right? Whereas without the long run, people will get to the point of fatigue, maybe earlier, maybe not earlier, but once they're at that point, their staying power, right, their ability to hold X intensity for Y duration is totally imploded. I will also say that I felt that we seemed to go flat if we went more than 2 weeks without a long run, because I would always drop the long run, which I tried to put it over the hilliest course that I could find, but I tried to also pick a variation for the course, not do the same course every year, but then that was the loop for the season. And prior to those last 2 years, we were also doing a long run, but it was more like 13, 14 miles. So the 18-mile run was a progression up from that. And, I felt that the runners would go flat after a while. But I also think it's the case, though, too, that, the runners didn't always get to do enough challenging races to really find out. And again, this is assuming the fitness was there. Otherwise, this would be a useless exercise. But to find out if they can really be in those races and to feel comfortable and normalize, that velocity and that intensity and running, like that, and having people around them and people going, whipping by them, reckless, unsustainable velocities. These races can, the courses, can get pretty congested pretty quickly, and it can make it difficult to, try to move up. If you start feeling really good and then the people around you are starting to struggle, you can kind of basically be stuck, which doesn't mean that you should be taking it out hard, but finding just that equilibrium, right? And how to navigate that stuff and what to do while still racing efficiently with your energy. It's hard to really reach conclusions sometimes about what happens at the end of the season, because the environment of those meets, unless you have a really supportive school around taking your team and going out of the way to find, big meets, every weekend, every other weekend. And you really do need to do that every week, which it's it's a 3-mile race once a week. If you can't manage the training for the athletes to recover from one 3-mile race every week, you got a bigger problem in terms of your training for your athletes. So, this is where, I think my perspective on the value of the long run is pretty, it's tricky to break this down, and I think for my personal experience, I always felt just better with my running when I would get into and start to feel comfortable on a longer run once a week. But for me, I never really got to see that necessarily transform into anything, because there's so many other variables at play that you're not also sort of controlling or keeping constant. So this is part of this. These are kinds of things that make it hard to identify the value of the long run, because we have to try to separate our assigned value or the value we ascribe because of influences like tradition to the long run. And we also have to not simply and uncritically accept, whatever science sounding thing we find on the internet as gospel. Sometimes people, because research can be very challenging and frustrating, people will just sort of be more inclined to be like, well, I'm just going to take this and I guess, hey, this sounds good, this must be true, right? Because they don't really want to have to work for that. So can we try to use a more measured IRL example and real life example? Yes, right? And there's probably a lot of those out there. And if you have any experiences or perspectives on, the positives or negatives of doing longer runs or, longer specific endurance sessions in your training, I'd love to hear what people's perspectives are on that and try to incorporate that into our consideration of this topic going forward. So feel free to send us a message on our Instagram at Black Cats Run. But I have an experience last fall where I did a series of 30 milers from August through October. So I guess summer into fall. And I think that, this is an area where I feel I can most definitively demonstrate the experience of a noticeable transformation and my ability to deal with that challenge of going for a distance. So I've done 8, I think, 30-mile runs, 8 approximately 50K runs over the last 2.5 years, which does not make me an ultra athlete. And that's actually kind of one of the points, is that I think one of our concepts of what stamina is and how far it's acceptable to train is something that is really influenced by tradition and our perceptions of how much is a lot, right? We're going to then scale and interpret what we're doing relative to that, right? Just like we try to say oh, well, am I training hard enough? Well, what are other people doing? Okay, well, I'm doing that too, so that's good. I'm training hard enough, so that means I'm going to get better. That's a really stupid, non-rational way to try to reach conclusions. And so these 8 runs, this is just kind of the scale of the sample size. So I just threw in the other 3 that I had done prior to that sort of more sort of compressed, compacted, or more consistent series, I guess, of 5 there, just for some context. And I know that there are people who do longer runs that are much better than this, but for me, this is a data point that's worth, I think, assessing, because this is the longest runs that I've ever done. I think that I found them to be fairly challenging. Some more challenging than others, as you're probably going to hear here. So the first one I did on February 28th of 2021, and this was like, as is true with some of these, a lot of these was sort of more impulsive than prepared for. And that loop was about, looking at my Strava, was 29.5 miles. It averaged 8:45 pace. It took 4 hours and 18 minutes. And I felt great until we got to about 22, 23 miles. And then I started to feel like cooked, like literally cooked. I find in these long distance efforts, and this was again in the winter, so it was quite cool, that like I literally start to feel like my brain is in my skull has been plugged into the wall like it's a crock pot, and like I'm starting to get cooked, and I feel like that sense of overheating, but not in like a heat stroke way, but just like I'm like an engine. That's what I imagined if I was an engine having overheated, assuming that car engines have consciousness, which they don't, but what that might feel like. And over the course of that run, in the first third of that run, my heart rate was in the 130s and 140s, and by the last hour of this run, maybe even the last 90 minutes-ish, my heart rate was in the 160s to 170s, but my velocity was not changing. And this is the theme that I want to emphasize to people here, is that a lot of times you have this scaling of heart rate across the duration of the session, and that doesn't always, by the way, correlate to feeling badly, but sometimes it does. And, by a lot of I did an episode called The Heart Knows, where I talked about what I feel the limitations are of using heart rate as a training tool or as a training measurable, because I think when we're doing this stuff, like, it's very easy to fall into the trap of like, oh, well, the heart rate means this. And so, but like when you do efforts of this length, what you realize is that the force you're doing, the work you're doing is not changing, but the heart rate goes up and up and up. So this idea that the heart rate tells you how hard you're working, this is one of the reasons why I don't think that that's ultimately really a very valid conclusion. I think it's a reflection of stress, but it isn't even a reflection of like quality of performance, because I've had, some times doing these longer things where I've found the heart rate going up and up and still have felt pretty good and just kept going right along. And then I've had ones where I felt good and the heart rate has stayed steady the whole time, right? So that's where the whole thing, there's more variables that influence that. Now, what I would really want to know with these examples is what the heck was going on with the blood lactate, for instance. I don't have that data. Maybe in the future I'll see if I can try to do something like that if I'm feeling motivated to go out and do multiple 30-mile runs with lactate testing at fixed intervals. Just kind of a tall order. But if that's something that you're interested in, let me know, and maybe that will encourage me to get my butt out the door and try that stuff at some point over the winter. So the second one I did was basically a year later. That was at the beginning of January of last year. So January 2nd, 2022, and that was 30.4 miles. And that was a cool run because there's also 3,600 feet of climbing, without going on trails. So it was just on paved roads or dirt roads, but all, maintained, roadways. And that was like 9:05 pace, and that took 4 hours and 35 minutes. And I felt good the whole way on this one. And my heart rate was consistently 140s to 150s the whole way. But it was probably the worst incidence of nipple chafing I've ever experienced. I had a white wool merino long sleeve on as my sort of base layer shirt. And when I finished, I took off my other layers. They had these like palm-sized blood stains, on the top of my shirt. That was bizarre because I didn't feel any abrasion, thank goodness. But that was pretty wild. So I felt good, but apparently I was hemorrhaging blood through my mammaries as I went. So then I did another one that year that was March. That was 33 miles. That took 4 hours and 49 minutes, and that was like 8:45 pace. And the heart rate went from the 140s to the 160s. And, I wouldn't say that I tied up, but, it got harder. But I think a lot of that was just definitely that I was getting thirsty and tired, but I wasn't struggling, right? So, you're seeing some heart rate variation here. So then, all right, so these are my experiences with these before getting into this stretch. So then the next three I did over from the last day of July. I did one on July 31st, August 19th, which was a race. And then I did one on September 2nd, September 18th, and October 2nd. So over that time span of, I guess, you could probably simplify that and say that was basically like August, September, right? So approximately 2 months. So the first one was a nightmare. It was extremely hot. I was running exclusively on this logging road around a lake in the backwoods in Maine. And that took almost 5 hours. And I really just started dying at 18 and 19 miles. And, I think my heart rate was probably 140s to the first half. And then even slowing down dramatically, my heart rate was still 20 beats higher over the last 10 miles. And I got to the point where first, after lying in a stream, in a culvert that went under the road for 10 minutes, I was just sort of like jogging in the parts that were in the shade and then just sort of walking through the parts that were in the sun. And like just so very moderate, very low effort, but the heart rate was still, pretty high. But that was a nightmare. That was probably the worst one on this list. Then the one I did in the sort of middle to end of August was the Gravel Worlds race that has come up before on the pod, but that was the race where you did the 50K run, and then the next day you did the 150-mile gravel race, and that was like 9:11 pace. And I don't think I did any run longer than 11 miles between the Death March in the Maine woods and then this one. So this took about 4 hours and 49 minutes. And this one I felt awesome for 23 miles. And then I was just dying like a pig. And my heart rate was 150 for probably the first half of the race. And then probably by the last 45 minutes, my heart rate was in the 180s. And I was every step was a struggle. That was one of those things where it's not like I can't maintain the speed the way it feels if you're running like the 800 or you're doing a middle distance, short distance race. It was just an incredible amount of difficulty, right? My legs were so heavy. And it was kind of weird because the one before this, I couldn't run the whole distance. And then the one I did subsequent to this on the 18th, on September 2nd, really wasn't a 30-mile run. I was just doing a 30-mile run with a friend of mine, and it was supposed to be a 50K loop. And then I got to 21 miles and I just failed. And there my heart rate went from the low 140s to up until the last few miles before I got to the point where I was just I'm done. My heart rate was in the 170s. And I don't always look at it. It's just I feel bad. And, for me, I don't feel like I'm hyperventilating when my heart rate is in the 170s. But there is just sort of this general sense of I feel like I'm working really hard to go pretty slow. And afterwards, when I saw that, I was like, okay, wow, I guess a little bit validating. Because in the past, without heart rate stuff, you just kind of think, what's wrong with me? Am I mentally weak? Because you're not trying to go any faster, but all of a sudden you're struggling. And that was that 21 miles was 9:14 pace. So it was not anything remarkable. One of the things is it's a lot harder to do these in the summer, right? So that's another factor we're seeing for endurance, is that the conditions in which you're doing these sessions seems to have a big impact, and you can be significantly stronger, at least in terms of the substance of what you're able to create from your training, than in the winter, right? If the weather is the right weather for you, then in the summer. So then on the 18th, we did the same loop again, so a couple weeks later. And so I did the whole loop, 50K, 31.6 miles or whatever that is. And that took 4:41, and that was 8:54 pace for me. And I was in the 1:30 starting, and then this time I started getting tired, but I kept going. It was not pleasant. I just really struggled the last 9 miles, and I was in the 170 beats a minute. And then when I get to the last one, so if we think about this as a series of 5 over basically 2 months, on October 2nd, I do the last one, same loop that I had done previously. And that one I did at 8:30 pace, since I took 4:39. And that was 140s to 170s, 180s. But we were running, the three of us were out there, including Jillian, who, blew up and couldn't run anymore after like 18 miles. So I felt badly, and so that she was stuck out there. So I was like, okay, well, I guess we'll run faster to get back to the car. Which in hindsight, I don't really know why I did that. Like, what was the point? But, I ran the last 10 miles at like 7:20 pace. So my heart rate was higher because I was doing that, but I, felt very strong, doing that. And so I get to the end of this, cycle, if you want to call it a cycle, or this phase of doing these, 50 kilometer-ish plus or minus efforts, or at least intended to be about 50 kilometers if you set aside the one in the middle where I struggled. And by the last one, now I'm starting to feel pretty competent at this. And then, as is the way with these things, I didn't continue to do 50 kilometer runs as I went forward. So it seemed like what was unique was, for this run was so long, and I got very tired, and I would spend a while being tired. I would get to the point where I couldn't run anymore. And yet by the 5th one, in basically 2 months, I felt great the whole way. And I freely admit that I lacked the motivation that is needed to go out and run 4.5 to 5 hours by myself. I think, partly it's because the potential rewards in terms of racing are ambiguous at best for me. It's not like I'm competing to win some big prize or do some really exciting race or event, right? So sense of well, what's my return on investment? My return on my ability to run 30 miles is a lot better, but at a certain point, it's well, that's a huge chunk of my time, on the weekend. It's not something that I can just do any day, right? And then it's you are pretty tired. And then if you have to go to work the next day, it's you're a total zombie. It's not like the workplace, has a nap room set aside for you. So, I think that it would have been interesting to keep going with that, every 3 weeks and see what the continued effect would have been. But I haven't had the motivation to do that. I think maybe with a different sense of value or outcome, I think I would have wanted to keep doing that. But for me, it's okay, unless somebody else wants to go out and do this stuff, what's the point after that? Because again, that's a huge, amount of time. And then the whole day just sort of is a wash, because then you're just you're pretty wiped out. And it's not that it's not fun and rewarding to do. It's just to keep up with that. Right. But that's, I think, the point, right? Is one of the challenges we see is continuing to want to go out and do it, because of the sense of to keep, probably the best way to stay good at running 50K would be to continue to run 50K. And, if you're probably a super fit athlete, maybe you can do that in 3 hours. Well, now you're dealing with a whole different can of beans, right? Versus me trying to be out there, maybe on my best day, I've only ever done this done this stuff at 8:30 pace, which I feel great about that. But, on the scale of, what people can do, that's a joke for that kind of a distance. I think I, saw something the other day that guy ran 50 miles and like world record, it was like 5:45 pace for 50 miles on the road. So, right, and these people, it's not as publicized because it's not like, it just doesn't have that social status, but, that's incredible to me, right? Somebody running 5:45 pace for that long, but that right there, right, raised some questions about like endurance, right? Obviously you would conclude that he must have a pretty good lactate threshold, but right, what about other factors, right? What's he doing to get the endurance to hold that kind of a tempo for 50 miles? So, but another question, right, in pursuit of that answer is to ask, like, what is it that was changing for me that improved my ability to do these runs, right? And then, a secondary question is, was this the best way to do this, to just go out and throw myself against this barrier of 50-kilometer run every couple weeks, and then eventually, right, I get better. But like there was a lot of trauma and epic struggle, in there to reach that finish line of, adaptive capacity. So like, at the same time, right, again, it's not that I was doing less work, but I was getting more efficient doing the work. And I was actually doing the last one, I did the most work because I went the fastest, especially over the last 10 miles. And, and for me in general, like I wasn't going out, I don't usually go out and run 10-mile runs in 72 minutes, so that was the other thing that was weird about some of these, is that I had big sections in some of these loops where I was running, much stronger than I would, going out in the morning before work if I'm doing a run at 5:30 or whatever. And I'm not going to go out and I don't casually go out and run 10 miles in 72 minutes. That's just not something that I do, right? So then in the context of this run, to be going out and doing it, and I think a lot of people have experienced this, where you get in these long runs and you just start feeling really great. And then you turn around and you go to do a race and then it's not there anymore, right? So, there's also the question of like recovery, and what was going on with that. So I don't think that the adaptation for the endurance happens because of getting to the point of fatigue, because I don't want to confuse this example with this sort of idea of validating this failure training. I wasn't trying to train into failure. It's just like that's sometimes what happened. I was actually trying not to use energy. I was trying to go as easy as possible, but still actively be running. And then it just happened that you get to the point of exhaustion, right? Like if you're just not conditioned enough to go that far, then it's just not going to happen, at least not at a exertion where you continue to run the whole way. So, if we take this notion, though, of the value of a long run, right, and how do we perceive that, and we say that something is happening in the long run that is impacting where we get to this point of fatigue, and then sort of by being in that state of fatigue, and then if we revisit that with frequency, we start to become less easily like brought down by that fatigue. We become more resistant to the fatigue, which is also to say that we basically become more efficient and it feels subjectively easier to do more work. So what's going on there and what's driving that, and the better we could get at identifying what's really driving that, the better we're going to be at figuring out how to reach an interpretation about what would really improve our endurance fitness going forward. Thanks for listening to today's episode. We're going to have a follow-up where we're going to talk about, in a follow-up episode, about some other ideas or suggestions about how to try to pursue or break down the value of the long run, or whatever the alternative sport equivalent to the long run is, how we could try to then take that understanding to better incorporate the developments of endurance and stamina into our training process. So if you've enjoyed this episode or other episodes on the podcast, we'd love it if you'd recommend to other people that find it interesting. You can also check us out on our Instagram page at Black Cats Run. Please feel free to send us a message if there's anything that you're interested in that you'd like to hear more about, or other topics that haven't been addressed but you'd like to see be addressed. If they're relatively short, straightforward questions, or questions that wouldn't maybe make a whole episode, if we get enough of them, maybe we can do an episode where we just go through a series of listener questions and respond to those. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.